Peter was said, one of the problems Mark has is that Mark is not an apostle. And the early church, when they ask what books get in the Bible and out of the Bible, we've looked at this before in terms of canonical, which books are canonical, they were usually associated with an apostle. So Matthew was an apostle, John was an apostle, Paul was an apostle. He's going to write the epistles and things. James was a brother of Jesus, and Jude was the brother of Jesus. Those were questioned a little bit. And what about this one with Mark? It turns out that Mark, while he's not an apostle, was associated very early. Papias, one of the early church fathers, says that basically, Papias says this. Let me read it from the early 2nd century. Mark, having become the interpreter or translator of Peter, wrote down accurately, however, not in order, all that he had recalled of what was either said or done by the Lord. For he had neither heard nor followed the Lord. But later, as I said, he followed Peter. Who used to adapt his instructions to the needs, but with a view of making an orderly account of the Lord's sayings. The logia. And this statement from Papias is recorded for us in Eusebius. Eusebius was an early church father who was a kind of a historian. Eusebius was the early historian of the church, right around 325, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. Eusebius, the church historian, records Papias saying that Peter was basically John Mark's mentor. And by the way, the Scriptures confirm that. And if you look over to 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13, and I've got it written down here, so let me just read it from the paper here. It basically says, Peter says, 1 Peter 5:13, she who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends greetings. And so does my son Mark. Now, when he says my son Mark, that's not talking about his literal son. This is talking about John Mark. Where is Peter? This is Peter at the end of his life. Where is Peter? Peter is in Rome. Peter is going to be crucified in Rome, probably under the Neronian persecutions. Nero was the emperor there. You remember, if I'm not mistaken, that Nero burned down parts of Rome that he was wanting to remodel. And as he burned down parts of Rome, he had to blame it on somebody. It's kind of like whenever you get an executive figure, it's like it's supposed to be their fault. Well, it's never their fault. They take credit for everything, but whose fault is it? Their fingers always go like that, pointing out it was their fault. The former administration, or the Senate, or the Congress. It was always somebody else's fault. They take blame for nothing. They take credit for everything. Anything goes good, they take credit. Anything that's bad, they blame it on somebody else. And so you get this kind of thing going on here. She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends greetings, and so does my son Mark, okay? So Peter is in Rome, and he says, my son Mark. Mark is his son. He's a spiritual son. And notice it uses the code word Babylon. The people in Babylon send greetings. Where is Babylon? Babylon, Peter is in Rome. And what's happening in Rome? Nero burning the city down, and then he blames it on the Christians. And so what he does is he dips the Christians in certain type of flammable material, puts them on poles, and he burns Christians alive. And it said that basically there's Christians burning, we're lighting up Rome as Nero was burning Christians alive and this kind of stuff. It was really wicked. Now Peter is going to be crucified, and when Peter, the rumor from church history has it, that when Peter was going to be crucified, he said to the people who were crucifying, I'm not worthy to be crucified like Jesus was. Normally you're crucified, your hands and your feet nailed up and things like that. He said, I'm not worthy to, so they crucified Peter upside down. I can't imagine that. But anyways, they crucified him upside down because he said, I'm not worthy to die like my Lord. Now, Paul, on the other hand, Paul was a Roman citizen. So when Paul died, they beheaded him. They could not crucify Paul because Paul was a Roman citizen. So Paul would have been beheaded. Peter was crucified upside down as far as church goes. But he says, I'm in Babylon. And my son Mark sends greeting. Peter and Mark were in Babylon, or were in Rome together. Babylon is a code word. Babylon is a code word for Rome. Now that's important later on when we look at the book of Revelation and we see the word Babylon again. Babylon is a code word for Rome. And you need to understand that Peter uses it here in reference to his relationship with Mark and things. And so that's kind of a cool thing. So Peter and Mark are close. Peter calls him his friend. Now, there's a problem here. Barnabas, it turns out, is John Mark's older cousin. Okay? Paul says in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, my fellow prisoner Aristarchus sends you his greetings, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas. Now, who is Barnabas? Barnabas was a wealthy guy from Cyprus who went out on the first missionary journey. Barnabas, his name Barnabas, Bar means son of, Nabas, son of consolation. Barnabas is kind of like an encouraging person in the early church. He's a wealthy person who's from Cyprus. He and Paul, Barnabas and Paul, go on the first missionary journey. And it's basically Barnabas wants to take who? Wants to take John Mark with them on their first missionary journey. So it says in Acts chapter 12, verse 25, John Mark goes with Barnabas and Paul to Antioch. Antioch, north of Jerusalem. Antioch is where Christians were first called Christians, and the three missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul, the first missionary journey, second missionary journey, third missionary journey, are all going to start from Antioch in Syria. And so they go there, and John Mark goes with them. And it says, when Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned to Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. And they basically, there it is, down in chapter 13, when they go out on their first missionary journey. Let me see if I've got this up here. Yeah, first missionary journey, Barnabas and Paul being commissioned to go on that missionary journey. And in chapter 13, verse 5, it says, when they, Paul and Barnabas, arrived at Salamis, they proclaimed the word of God in the Jewish synagogues. As was their custom, they always started with the Jewish synagogues. John was with them as their helper. John was with them as their helper. So John Mark apparently went with Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey. They went to Cyprus. Cyprus was Barnabas' home. Then they headed up to Turkey. They went across over to Turkey. Turkey is where Paul was from, Tarsus, and that kind of thing. And so what happens? The problem is John Mark quits. On the first missionary journey, John Mark quits. Okay? It says, for Paphos, Paul and his companions sailed to Perga, and in Pamphylia, where John left them and returned to Jerusalem. Now, in the text, it doesn't say anything really negative about John Mark at that point. But later on, we find out that there was a rift between Paul and John Mark, and that Paul actually broke up his relationship with Barnabas. It was Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey. On the second missionary journey, when they come back and they're up at Antioch again, and Barnabas says, hey, let's take John Mark again and let's go out again. Paul, Barnabas, and John Mark. Let's go like the three of us did before. Paul says, over my dead body, he says, I'm not taking that kid anywhere. And so Paul really is so upset with John Mark that Barnabas and Paul split. Paul takes Silas on his second missionary journey, and Barnabas takes John Mark and goes off back to Cyprus, where Barnabas was from. And so basically you've got this division between Paul and Barnabas. Now think about how close Paul and Barnabas were. Paul and Barnabas did their first missionary journey together, spending all that time traveling. And then Paul was what? Paul was stoned and left for dead. He was beat up how many times? Barnabas was there with him that whole time. It would be like almost coming close to death with somebody. You get close. Kind of the band of brothers idea that these guys are really close. They've seen a lot of hardship together. And yet, because of this conflict between Paul and John Mark, Paul won't take John Mark the second time. There's a big problem there, and Paul rejects John Mark then.